Hello and welcome to the latest DTP podcast. I'm Stuart, and today DTP consultant Diane Carney is here to shed light on the new consumer standards for social housing providers. These are set to take effect from April 2024. Hello Diane, thanks for joining us today.
Hi Stuart, it's great to be here with you.
Well, let's dive right in. First off, please can you explain where things are up to with the new consumer standards? I understand the regulator of social housing is currently consulting on them.
Yes, that's right. When the Social Housing Act received royal assent earlier this year, it revised one of the regulator's fundamental objectives around consumer regulation. So the Act allowed the regulator to set new regulatory standards for registered providers, which the regulator has duly done, and they were published in July. So the consultation period lasts for 12 weeks, which allows stakeholders time to provide feedback before the deadline of the 17th of October.
Thanks, Dan. A very concise explanation in terms of where we're up to. But perhaps before we look at the new standards, let's try and understand the impact of the existing standards. These were introduced in 2012, and we've certainly seen an increase this year in the regulator identifying breaches.
Yes, unfortunately, when you look at the number of referrals overall across all of the standards, they were up by 44% last year when you compare them to 2021-22. Interestingly, there was a marked jump in the self-referral category. So an increased number of providers were contacting the regulator to report either breaches or potential breaches in the standards. The removal of the serious detriment test in the new standard, that's going to lower the bar for the regulator to become involved with the provider. So it's highly likely that moving forward we'll see increases in future years too.
So it sounds like there's going to be increased pressure on social housing providers. So as the consultation is underway, which I guess nothing's set in stone yet, but can you just give our listeners some indication of what the standards will look like and how do you think these new standards will differ from the existing ones?
Yes, sure. And I think first and foremost, it's important that we don't just talk about the standards in isolation. They're obviously critical to regulation, but they do form part of a new, wider consumer regulatory framework. Okay. So the standards themselves and how the regulator can enforce the standards, that represents a big shift in consumer regulation, probably the biggest for a significant amount of time. The new consumer standards, it's fair to say it puts consumer regulation on the same footing as economic regulation. So the regulator has new objectives around safety and around transparency, and they absolutely are reflected in the new standards. We can see a significant difference when we read the draft. There's an improved focus on tenant safety, and there's a clear drive to improve the quality of the tenant and landlord relationship. So within the neighbourhood and community standard, there's now a specific expectation that providers will have a domestic abuse policy, and they'll also have a detailed approach to tackling hate crime. The tenancy standard, that gives much greater prominence to tenants' sustainability, which is obviously critical in the cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in. And there's also a new government direction on mutual exchanges. So the home standard and the tenant involvement and empowerment standard, they've seen quite significant change when compared to the other two standards. So those will be replaced with two new ones, and they'll be called the Safety and Quality Standard and the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Standard. And when you read the standards overall, fairness, respect, transparency, meeting the diverse needs of tenants, they underpin all of the new standards.
That's quite a thorough explanation. I think we can probably dig deeper into each of these further on in the podcast. Just before we do that, how would these consumer standards impact the day-to-day operations of social housing providers?
From the work we've done in the sector so far, we see many providers who are all at different stages in delivering against the standards. So it's quite difficult to give a catch-all answer. I think each organisation will be feeling the day-to-day impact differently. The regulator is still going to take a risk-based approach to regulating the standards, and the standards themselves remain outcome-focused, which is great because it means that organisations can choose how best they would like to deliver their compliance with the standards. It's very much still a flexible approach from the regulator, so long as they get the outcome that's needed. Undoubtedly, the main impact will be seen in the two standards that's seen significant change, which is the home standard and the tenant involvement and empowerment standard.
So, Dan, you said before these would now be the safety and quality standard and the transparency, influence and accountability standard. Go on, just give me a little bit more detail and our listeners a little bit more detail about these.
Yeah, for sure. So the safety and quality standard, there's an added emphasis on a provider's stock. And there's an expectation that providers will absolutely understand the condition of the stock. That understanding, it must be up to date, it must be well documented, and critically, and what's a big change here, is that it needs to be based on a physical assessment of the properties and the homes that they own. So this moves away from the traditional sampling approach to stock condition. So this may prove a challenge for some providers. So, for example, there might be issues around capacity and availability of surveyors, or simply the cost of undertaking a full stock condition survey. But moving forward, providers will need to be 100% confident that the records they hold in relation to stock, that they're accurate, and that importantly, they can triangulate the data with the various data sources that they hold internally. There will still be an expectation that providers use their data to ensure the homes are well maintained and of good quality. One new area in the standard is specifically around health and safety, which covers health and safety of tenants in their home. So that includes being able to demonstrate that as a provider, you're meeting all health and safety legal requirements, which could be gas checks, it could be electrical, water hygiene, the whole property compliance piece. That obviously goes along with delivering on the decent home standard and all repairs and maintenance requirements. So just on repairs and maintenance, a big change in the new standard is that it proposes to remove the right first time requirement for works. So repairs and how a provider communicates with tenant around repair works, that absolutely has to be more tenant centric. The new standard will be asking providers to stipulate timescales for repairs, but that's only after taking into account tenant views on what those repair timescales should be. So a big shift there in terms of transparency and information.
Yeah, these are certainly major changes, aren't they? And probably quite
Absolutely.
contentious in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. And
Yeah.
how that sits with the tenant as well and how that's
Yeah.
communicated to them is going to be quite a challenge, I would have thought,
Yeah.
for providers.
Leading up to the creation of these standards, the regulator has obviously listened to feedback from the sector, feedback from tenants, and one of the main areas that tenants raised as problematic and an issue was around repair works and being kept informed. So it's great to see that the regulator has reflected that in the new standards.
And also, Diane, the transparency, influence and accountability standard, can you give us a little bit of background about how that will look?
Yes, it's a very long title.
It certainly is a mouthful, that.
It isn't. It just rolls off the tongue. It does encompass everything that's in the title of the new standard.
It does what it says on the side of the tin, I guess.
Absolutely. So this new standard, this will be where the regulator sets out their expectations on providers embedding a culture of transparency and accountability to their tenants. But as I said earlier, fairness, respect, they're key drivers. Tenant access to information about the services they have, and more importantly, how they can influence decision making. That's critical in this standard. So providers moving forward, they'll be required to demonstrate that they really understand the diverse needs of the tenants, and more importantly, that they use that information and data to inform how they will meet the different needs of tenants. So it's about joining that all up. And again, this might be another area where some may find it a little bit challenging or difficult. If a provider doesn't already hold this information on their tenant base, gathering that from scratch, it'll be a big task.
A heck of a challenge.
Absolutely. And I think linked to that, there's also an expectation that providers need to show and demonstrate how they've listened to tenants. So all the feedback that they receive, how have they translated what they know from their tenants into tangible actions that improve the services that they deliver? So we're going to need to see very clear listening, understanding and change processes needed in organisations. And I think a great way to do that is through the complaints feedback that organisations will get. And the transparency, influence and accountability standard, that's been drafted to work alongside the Housing Ombudsman Service. And that's great for setting out expectations around how providers should be handling complaints. So definitely worth a read if people haven't already done that.
Okay, I'm sure our listeners will do that, and we'll obviously keep them up to date by the social media channels. There's a lot of changes, isn't there, in terms of improving all aspects of the social housing sector.
Definitely.
It's probably just worth trying to understand how these fit with other things that have come down the pipeline. So how will the new standards work with the new tenant satisfaction standards, which were introduced earlier this year?
You've hit the nail on the head in terms of there's definitely been a shift. And personally, I think it's great to see all of the changes in one place under the new standards rather than having to access different documents over a number of years to gather that. So just in particular for the tenant satisfaction measures, they now have a home within the transparency, influence and accountability standard. So in that standard, there's some specific expectations around performance information that providers will need to disclose to the regulator. So that encompasses the tenant satisfaction measures and everything that goes with them, but it also has some additional requirements built in. So if you think the sector, it's in the first year of collecting the data for the measures, and the first publication of the data will be 2024, which coincides obviously when the new standards are going to be introduced. So I think in short, to demonstrate compliance with the new standards, landlords must be fulfilling the requirements of the satisfaction measures.
You've set out quite a lot in this podcast so far, a lot to take in. What steps should social housing providers now be taking to ensure a smooth transition to meeting the requirements of the new consumer standards by next April? It's not far off, but we're talking sort of 6-7 months now.
Absolutely. It'll be here before we know it. And it's still really important that providers continue to meet the existing standards while starting to prepare for the new ones. So having that handover transition period. The regulators issued a draft code of practice to go with the new standards, which is also out for consultation. And that's aimed to help providers and tenants understand how compliance might be achieved with the new standards. So there's some great examples in there. And I think in terms of preparing for a smooth transition, providers, they need to be familiarising themselves with what's in the new standards, also identifying who their nominated person will be for the consumer standards, which is another new requirement. The regulators being quite clear that compliance with the new standards is required from April 2024. So it's important that providers know where they are against the new standards. Ideally, a self-assessment against those new ones would be great. I think it's a really useful tool to help you identify areas where you're doing great and you're really strong in, as well as identifying areas that may need some attention or may need some tweaking. And obviously once the self-assessment is completed, you can map those outcomes into an action plan, and that can help you focus on your journey to April 2024. They're also great documents to be able to share with your board members and also your tenants alike for transparency.
So Diane, you're obviously working with social housing providers, yourself and the team at DTP. What sort of things are you doing with them to help them to prepare for these new standards?
Well, we can definitely support with self-assessments and conducting gap analysis. And what we have done is we've either validated self-assessments that have already been done by providers, so always good to get that external pair of eyes on the work that you've done. But we can also help a provider to complete a brand new one. We've a range of materials and experience at DTP to do that. As it's a new area, we can also provide training around the proposed standards. We always like to try and help providers grow and build their in-house knowledge. So that could be training for board members, it could be for frontline staff, it could be for exec teams. We can be very flexible with that. If people would prefer a more specific approach, if they're happy with the framework and there might be one or two areas they need independent advice on, we can do that too. So we've done verification of tenant satisfaction measures frameworks. We've recently completed a complaints framework review too. I think it's important that we have that flexible approach so we can tailor our services to what clients need.
Well, thanks very much for that, Diane. Some really great insights. And for our listeners, DTP will keep you updated about the new consumer standards on our website and social media channels. If anyone wants to speak to Diane about the standards, you can email her on d.carney, CARNEY, @dtp.uk.com. You can also find her email address in the post accompanying this podcast. So thanks for tuning in and keep watching out for more DTP podcasts. Thanks, Diane.
Thanks, Stuart. It's been a pleasure.